The voicemail was still on his phone. Caleb Monroe knew this the way you know things you have decided not to look at directly, which is completely and at all times, and he knew it every morning when he picked the phone up and every evening when he set it down, and the knowing had the weight of something that had been there so long it had stopped feeling like weight and started feeling like part of the structure. He had not listened to it. He had not deleted it. It had been there for 8 months, and the name above it was Danny Marsh, and the timestamp said 9:47 p.m. on a Thursday in October, and that was the last call Danny had made before he died. And Caleb had been in a briefing at 9:47 p.m. on a Thursday in October and had seen the name light up the screen and had thought, I'll call him back after, and had not called him back after because by after there was nothing left to call. The dog arrived on a Tuesday in June. A Vizsla, rust golden, lean and long-legged, with amber eyes that held a quality Caleb recognized before he could name it, the specific attention of something that has been looking for a particular person and is not yet sure whether it has found them or only found the nearest available version. He stood in the doorway of his house in Clarksdale, Mississippi, and the dog stood on the porch steps and looked at him, and neither of them moved for what felt like a very long time. If this story finds you tonight, tell us in the comments which city you are watching from, and subscribe to this channel before we go further. Because what stood on Caleb Monroe's porch steps in June was not simply the dog of a man who was gone. It was every conversation they had not finished, and the one they never started, and it was looking at him with Danny's dog's eyes, and he was going to have to decide what to do about that. Caleb Monroe was 46 years old and had grown up in a town 12 miles outside Clarksdale in the Mississippi Delta, where the land was flat and the sky was enormous, and the summers lasted past any reasonable point. He was lean and long-limbed with dark hair kept short and gray-green eyes that people in the Delta described as quiet, which was the word the region used for reserved. And he had left Clarksdale at 18 and joined the Navy and become a SEAL and spent 20 years operating in places that had nothing in common with the Delta except the heat, and had come back 2 years ago because his mother's health required it and because Clarksdale was the place he knew how to be from even when he couldn't figure out how to be somewhere. His father had died when he was 11, and his mother had raised him alone in a house on the edge of town with a vegetable garden and a ferocious sense of what was worth worrying about and what was not. And she had kept the house going through his entire career with the specific, understated fortitude of women who hold families together without making a project of it. And now she needed help, and he was the help, and this was straightforward and right, and also, in the way of things that are straightforward and right, insufficient by itself as a reason to continue. Daniel Marsh had been Caleb's closest friend from their first day in Bud.'s training, which was the kind of friendship that forms in conditions designed to break people and holds because of it. Danny had been from eastern Tennessee, sandy-haired and loud in the good way, the man in any group who made other people laugh without trying, and who was serious underneath the loudness, in a way that only came out in the field and in long conversations that ran past midnight with bad coffee and the specific honesty that exhaustion sometimes unlocked. He had a way of asking the right question at the right moment that Caleb had never seen him do consciously, as if he simply paid attention to people with enough thoroughness that the question arrived when it was needed rather than when it was convenient. He had married a woman named Pam who had the patience of someone who had chosen her life fully informed of its costs, and they had a daughter named Lily who was 7 now and had her father's laugh, which Pam had mentioned on the phone and which had cost Caleb something to hear. Danny had left the Navy at 41 with a knee injury that ended his operational career, and had spent 2 years trying to find what came after, in a way that looked, from the outside, like a series of reasonable decisions. A sales job, a move back to Tennessee, a house with a yard for Lily. From the inside, according to the letter Pam had found and shared with Caleb, because she had needed someone who had known Danny before, it had felt like being translated into a language he didn't recognize, a life built for someone he wasn't sure he was anymore. He had not told anyone this in a way that could be acted on. He had called Caleb on a Thursday at 9:47 p.m. and had not been called back, and by morning the translation had become complete and irreversible. The voicemail he left lasted 42 seconds. Caleb knew its length because he had looked at the display without opening it so many times that the number had become part of the architecture of the loss, as familiar and as inaccessible as everything else Danny had left behind. Pam had called in June, 8 months after the funeral, to say that she was moving back to her parents in Nashville, and that Rufus, Danny's Vizsla, needed a home, and that she was reaching out to the people Danny had loved because she thought one of them should have him, and she was sorry to ask, and she understood if Caleb couldn't. And Caleb had said yes before she finished the sentence, because saying no would have required an explanation he was not prepared to give. Rufus arrived on a Tuesday in a crate in the back of Pam's sister's car, and when Caleb opened the crate in the driveway, Rufus walked out and sat in front of Caleb and looked at him with those amber eyes and that quality of looking for a specific person. And Caleb understood that he was the closest available thing to what Rufus was looking for, and the understanding was the most painful thing he had felt since the morning he found out Danny was gone, and also, in some way he could not immediately explain, a relief. Rufus smelled the house the way dogs smell a new space, methodically and completely, and when he was done, he came and sat beside Caleb's chair, and that was where he stayed. And the sitting beside the chair was the thing that broke Caleb open the first time, quietly and without warning, alone in the house at 9 in the evening, because Danny had told him once in one of those post-midnight conversations that Rufus always knew when something was wrong and would come and sit beside you. And that was true, and Danny was not there to see it, and that was the specific, unbearable geometry of what loss does to the ordinary world. His mother met Rufus that evening and said, without prelude, that Danny's dog looked like Danny sounded on the phone, which was the most accurate description Caleb could have offered, and which he had not said. His mother had the quality. Miss Vera ran the diner on Sunflower Avenue that had been on Sunflower Avenue since 1974. A woman of 75, with silver locks pinned up, and a voice that carried the warmth and the gravity of someone who had fed this town through enough hard years to understand what food was actually for. She had known Danny because she knew everyone who had ever been connected to Clarksdale in any degree, and she had known Caleb since he was 9 years old and had decided, without making a production of it, that her job with him was to keep feeding him until he was ready for the other kind of nourishment. She slid things across the counter when she thought he needed them, an extra piece of pie on the bad weeks, a community calendar circled in red at events she thought he might survive attending, and eventually, on a Thursday in July, when she had apparently made the calculation that he was ready, the number for the VA crisis line folded into a paper napkin that she placed under his coffee without a word. Rufus was not technically permitted in the diner. Miss Vera permitted him anyway, on the grounds that a dog who had belonged to a Navy SEAL who died was entitled to whatever grace was available, and Rufus lay under the counter stool while Caleb ate, and the regulars said hello in the way of the Delta, which was slow and warm, and not hurried past into whatever came next. The thing that Caleb had not been able to bring himself to do for 8 months happened on a Sunday morning in August, which was the kind of hot and still that the Delta produces in August, where the air feels like something you have to move through rather than breathe. He was sitting on the porch at 5 in the morning because the heat made sleeping past 4 difficult, and Rufus was beside him with his amber head on Caleb's knee. And the sky was the dark blue of pre-dawn and the mockingbirds were starting. And Caleb picked up his phone and opened the voicemail and listened to it for the first time. He had been building toward it for weeks in the way that a person builds towards something hard, by doing all the smaller things first, cleaning the house, calling his mother, walking Rufus an extra mile each morning, as if the ordinary competence of daily life needed to be established before the harder thing could be approached. Danny's voice was different from how he remembered it in his daily memory, which had held Danny's voice at its most operational, competent, and brief. This voice was tired and searching and unmistakably Danny's, and what it said was that he was sorry to call late, and that he had been trying to get it together before calling, but couldn't quite manage it, and that Caleb was the person he always called when he couldn't manage it, and that he wanted to talk about what it felt like when the thing you were built for was gone and you couldn't figure out if you were still the same person without it, and that he was going to try him again tomorrow if he didn't pick up. He had not tried again tomorrow. Caleb sat with the phone in his hand for a long time after the message ended, and Rufus raised his head from Caleb's knee and looked at him with those amber eyes. And Caleb said out loud, "To the dog who had been the last living thing in the room with Danny, I should have picked up." And Rufus pressed his long, rust-colored face against Caleb's chest and breathed, slow and warm, and the mockingbirds kept singing in the pre-dawn dark. And Caleb stayed on the porch until the sky went from blue to gray to the washed gold of a Delta morning. And Rufus stayed with him through all of it, without moving, without requiring anything, as if staying was itself the whole of what he had come here to do. He called Pam that afternoon and he told her about the voicemail, and she listened and cried quietly in the way that people cry when they have already spent most of the available tears, and what is left is the specific grief of hearing the person's voice described by someone who loved them. He told her what Danny had said, and she said she had known something like that was on his mind, and that she wished she had known how to reach it. And Caleb said he wished he had picked up, and she said she knew he did, and that Danny had known it too, and that Danny had also known the kind of person Caleb was, which was not the kind of person who missed calls on purpose. She said that Lily still talked about the dog sometimes, asked if Rufus was okay, and Caleb said he would tell her that Rufus was doing his job, and Pam made a sound that was almost a laugh, and that was the closest either of them got to something lighter that day, and it was enough. It was not absolution, because absolution was not what was available or what either of them needed. It was the truth offered plainly by someone who had earned the right to offer it, which was its own different and necessary kind of thing. He called the VA crisis line that week about a support group for those who had lost someone to suicide, because Miss Vera had given him the number 3 weeks earlier by sliding it across the counter under his coffee without saying a word about why. And he had kept it in his shirt pocket and moved it to a different shirt pocket and back again over those 3 weeks, and now he used it. The group met on Wednesdays in a church hall 2 miles from his mother's house in Clarksdale. 8 or 9 people in folding chairs with the kind of honesty that only comes out in rooms where everyone is carrying the same specific thing and has stopped pretending otherwise. He had been going for 4 months now. Rufus waited in the truck. The voicemail is still on his phone because he has decided it is where Danny left it, and that is where it should remain. And he has listened to it twice more since August, and each time it costs something, and each time the cost is slightly different from the time before, which is what happens when grief becomes something you carry with you rather than something you hide from. Some grief is not about what you did or what you could have done. Some of it is simply the fact of absence, the specific weight of a person-shaped space